Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Edgar Cayce On. This one I've been anticipating for a couple of years because, as you can see, it's part 2 of Manifestations of Spirit in 3D. I did part 1 a couple of years ago, and it wound up so far being one of the most popular videos we've ever put on YouTube. So, with part 2 coming along, let's see what we have in store for us. First of all, we always start with a disclaimer to let everybody know that what you're seeing tonight is from me personally, my personal take of how I have interpreted the Edgar Cayce readings to mean the things that I'm talking about right now. There is no official Edgar Cayce worldview that is given even by the headquarters of Association for Research and Enlightenment, ARE, in Virginia Beach. So this is my own personal take, and I invite you to do more study on your own if it brings anything to question or of interest to you. Now, years ago, as a teacher in colleges, I found that my students enjoyed more than anything else I did in class the fact that I put an agenda up on the board before I began. So why not go ahead and talk about all the things we're going to cover today. Cayce's symbology, tying the Bible, metaphysics, and the 3D life that we all live in day to day here in human bodies together. Then I'm going to go into, if God created us, how can we have no beginning and no end? Pretty good question. What does it look like to go from nothingness to an infinite universe? And did physical life forms happen by random chance, or were they God's will? How many different dimensions are there? And what is it like to live in the first, the second, all the way up to the 8 dimensions that Cayce says are in this solar system? What does it look like to see the 3rd dimension from a 4th dimensional point of view? And do souls tend to stick together as they reincarnate on Earth? And what does karma look like from a spiritually lawful point of view? What is music like in other dimensions? And do our free will decisions actually cause the universe to rearrange itself? How far off is the Millennium, the promised 1,000 years of peace? And I'll finish by giving you scientific proof that God exists. Seriously. I know that's something that everybody keeps asking for, and it's out there, but whether it gets recognized as being that or not is what we will be able to hold up for discussion. The reason that I start with this is because it gives you an idea of how much research goes into this type of a presentation. What you're seeing here on top, on the very top row, are the 7 spiritual centers, often called chakras. So you have the gonads, the leiden, the adrenals, the thymus, the thyroid, pineal, and pituitary glands. And then, according to the Cayce readings, you see what the virtues are for each one, the faults, if you will, for each one of them, and then how do we go from a fault position to a virtuous position. And then it talks about the other things that very often come up in symbology, whether it be in the book of Revelation or many other sources that had to do with the colors, the elements, the figures that were used in Revelation, musical notes, the words of the Lord's Prayer, and even the planets in the solar system. So you can see with a matrix like this, it takes a long time to be able to put something like that together. And whereas there are individual readings that back up every bit of what you have right here, I'm not going to be covering that information tonight. Thank me for that. This first slide is actually a video, and it's about 3 minutes long. It really does a great job of describing why God's consciousness transcends time, space, and energy, and even matter. Now, for those of you that are here live, you're being able to read along with the script. You will, at home, with the YouTube videos, are going to wind up having the words to this right along with the video, so it'll be easier for you to follow with YouTube. But you don't have that, so that's how come I'm going to have to do it like words on the screen. It really does go by fast. So it's incredibly deep information, so please do try to follow along. And we're already convinced that God exists, many of us that are watching this video. But this gives a bridge, if you will, between the people that believe in God and those who don't. Go ahead and roll the video.
Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. This concept was established by Einstein's equation E equals mc squared and has been confirmed by numerous experiments. Therefore, energy has always existed and will always exist. This means that our current concept of time, where everything has a beginning and an end, is false. If we follow this line of reasoning, it should be obvious that any scientific theory that describes the origins of the universe is not actually describing the origin of energy, but rather of one particular expression of that energy. Science traces the origins of the universe to a timeless and motionless state called the singularity. Since the singularity is timeless, it cannot be talked about as before or after anything. If something exists but is not before or after anything, then it is now. Therefore, the singularity is now. Again, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Therefore, all of the energy in existence is present in a singularity. Time and space are one fabric. You cannot have one without the other. This is a basic premise of modern physics. There is no time in the singularity, therefore there is no space in the singularity. Without space and time, there can be no separation or individuation. Therefore, energy cannot be separated from the singularity. It is one entity, a unified monolithic field with no boundaries, and it cannot be broken up or divided in any way. This is the eternal and omnipresent root of the universe. This is the essence of what we are. And yet the relative universe exists. Separation and individuation exist. How do we reconcile this? How can two people sit down and have a conversation if they are both expressions of the same indivisible field of energy? A good way to conceptualize this is to use the metaphor of a video game on your computer. The characters in the game are all running on the same hardware. Their spatial separation is illusory, and their time-based interactions are expressions of pre-existing possibilities within this framework. It is the encoding of time that creates the possibility of interaction both in a video game and in the real world. In the video game, that code of time is stored with all the probabilities and possible outcomes coexisting on a disk. In the real world, the code of time with all the probabilities and possible outcomes resides in the singularity. This does not imply that our lives are predetermined and free choice is impossible. All probabilities, all possible outcomes coexist in one moment. But in each moment, we choose from those probabilities, and our lives are expressions of those choices. These choices aren't always rational or constructive, but this is due largely to a distorted view of who we are. If rather than viewing ourselves as strictly isolated individuals at odds with the outside world, we viewed ourselves as part of a single unified field of existence, how might that change the way we interact? How would we treat others if we understood that everything we do to them, we are actually doing to ourselves? Think about it.
So if you're able to grok all that in fullness, you'll recognize that what they're saying is what science calls the Big Bang, when there is a singularity, was a time where there was no time, where there was no space, where there was only pure singularity or pure consciousness, as the Cayce readings would describe such. So that would indicate that there is no beginning, no end to the eternal God that we believe in. And we'll go on from there to talk about the question that I brought up in the agenda that said, if God created us, that means we have a beginning. And in the Cayce readings, it says the things that have a beginning also have an end. Well, if we have a beginning and we're supposed to be eternal souls, how do we reconcile those concepts together? The video here helps to understand exactly what our relationship is to God and why all souls indeed are eternal beings, like God, without beginning and without end. So what you're seeing here is a zygote, and it's already divided into 2 and now 4 and now into 8 cells. This one happens to be of a frog, by the way. And it's showing that the cells are just dividing over and over again to the point where there are too many to count. As you're seeing it turn into an infinite number of souls, what we can see is that, let's imagine that this is a circle that it has no determinate size. It can grow as large as it ever needs to. And inside that circle, if we want to call that God, the original, the oneness of God, then we have the souls that were actually God's essence of God itself, and then divided an infinite number of times into the souls so that we are made in the exact image of God. So if you see this, if you look at this soul right here, or that soul, or that soul, or that cell, if you want to look at it from the picture here, say which one of those cells is older than the others. In fact, aren't they the exact same age as the original zygote? And once you understand that, then you're ready to understand the concept that God has always been and will always be. And even though God created us of his own essence, then we can say that we too are eternal beings. We just happen to have had the one consciousness, and now we have an infinite number of consciousnesses to go along with that. So what we have next is just what we call a little gift, or a moving graphic image that goes across the screen. And what I'm trying to do is to be able to talk about, why did God manifest a universe in the first place? if there is no manifest universe, then everything was really pretty much taking place in the mental plane, or as if it were a dream. And that means if you're thinking of dreaming right now, you go, okay, I've had dreams, and how much time, space, and energy did it require to have one? None. Okay, so if you're having pure thought and it's not manifesting in a physical plane, then you were just out there in pure consciousness. And that's what we're saying God was originally. Here you have this singularity, if you will, that's just bouncing along. But imagine if this is sitting there in nothingness, that you have one single point. How do you even know if it's moving? The only way that you know something is moving is if it winds up having a second point to be able to relate to. So this one ball, if you will, the singularity of the consciousness of God, needed something else in order to be able to manifest. Now here's the interesting part of the way that Cayce worded this. He said, when God said, let there be light, as it was in the Bible, the way that Cayce described it is to simply say, God moved. And when we think of movement, don't you have to have more than one point? Now, if you go back to the zygote, and I'm not going to, but if you go back to the zygote, you wound up going from one point to an infinite number of points to be able to move and live and have their very being within the concept or mind of God. So God thinks that everything should be unlimited. As you can see, that there's an infinite amount of time, an infinite amount of space, infinite amount of energy, and numbers, as in mathematics, try to come to the end of the last number you can count, etc. Everything's an infinity, so he created an infinite number of souls. So what happens when God moves? Now you start saying, going, this thing looks like it's coming out of nothingness, right? So when God said, let there be light, and all of this stuff, that was in dreams in his head, where if we want to talk about it being like an architect on paper, all of a sudden it gets built by this contractor, if you will, so that you have an architect that puts it into paper or on the paper, and then you have manifestation, which is the builder bringing it into a three-dimensional reality. So God moved, and all of a sudden it seems like it's coming out of nothingness, kind of like the Big Bang did, right? So the Cayce readings say that what happened to us in 3 dimensions is a past condition, because what happens to us is in this 3-dimensional area means that it happened first in our minds. We created it in our minds, and therefore we wind up having it manifested in the past because it was already in creation in our mental realm, if you will. So if we say God moved, and then all of a sudden what was in our heads, that means that thoughts became things. That doesn't mean that the Big Bang isn't real. In fact, I take that to mean that when God moves, we experience that in 3D as being the Big Bang. And that's the most incredible movement of creation that we humans could ever imagine. This is another way that I thought was an interesting manifestation of how it could be, because in the previous one there, it was all kind of black and white and a little, jagged coming at us. But I tend to think of it in this term, as in there's an infinite number of colors. And here's the manifest universe that's actually around that zygote in the middle. And we don't even pay attention to that zygote in the middle any longer. But this is truly it. This is God. This is the pure consciousness that we all share together. And this is the manifestation of the beautiful colors and the infinite variety of movement and everything that's going on around us that has a beginning and will have an end. But this part is eternal, and every time it changes its mind, manifestation will wind up changing in coordination with that. So now, here's another way to be able to look at it, especially if we're going with a metaphysical take of the yin and the yang. If you have the day and night, that's one of the chapters in A Search for God material, in which it talks about, in the day unto day showeth knowledge, night unto night, well, we better figure it out. Use the knowledge that we had in order to get through the tough times. And so from this point of view, we see this rotating in one direction and life kind of rotating in the other. It's I thought it was a nice graphic to be able to visually explain how, even though we still live and move and have our very being within the one circle that I keep coming back to as being the oneness of all things and the body of God in which we live and move and have our very being, we have all this motion that we take on as being reality or day-to-day life that constantly is in rotation around there. Next up is an interesting graphic. It kind of looks like a spider web, but watch what this thing does. Suddenly, does that start to look like a box? And it's a box with almost like a wireframe thing that comes up, and then watch, all of a sudden it comes back to the original pattern again. So it's something of an optical illusion. Some people initially see something like a spider web in the drawing, and others see a three-dimensional box where the center of the drawing is, the upper corner over there where the box is closest to you. But when you see what happens, it throws our either perspective into a tizzy. It really does. Because if you've ever wondered what could possibly exist beyond 3 dimensions, all you have to do is take a look at this thing and you're going, wow, what I thought was a box or what I thought was a spider web suddenly starts going into motion, and it just gives you a hint of how different things can be, how different they can move just by a simple graphic like this. Imagine when you add a 3rd dimension beyond this elementary glimpse into the perfect creative consciousness that we call God. Now, this next video is a fascinating one to me. And the reason what it does is it gives you a glimpse into how inevitable the appearance of physical life is in our manifest universe. In other words, the universe was absolutely going to have life in it. Now, what you're going to wind up seeing here in a second is a bunch of light bulbs. And it starts with a short one and goes down into a long one. And there's, I don't know, probably 7 of them hanging up there that are kind of at a diagonal like that. And they start swinging them back and forth. Go ahead and hit the video and we'll take a look. Now, you see he's getting all the balls going at one time. Now, you're going to start to see these patterns go random here in a minute. And it gets to be snake-like. But really, when you start to see that circular motion right there, there's something that's going to fascinating. To me, it's fascinating to watch it when it comes up. You're going to see a DNA helix appear at any moment. It does it twice throughout the video, but there you go. Now it just turns into a DNA helix right there, showing you that the randomness of all of the particles, the smallest particles that we have in the universe, and they just explode out there, and you just say, all at once, you just let them go. They naturally go into this DNA helix. To me, that is just such an indicator that says that life was inevitable within the universe and the way it comes about. What I want to go into next is the cycle of life, if you will, because God does like change, doesn't mind having cycles to the changes and repeating them over and over again, but change is a really big one. And what you're seeing right here is a beautiful picture of what starts out to be a leaf right here, and you just watch its life as the leaf starts out perfectly, and then it starts to get a little bit older, and you have the seasons and the color changes, and finally it disintegrates into the ground, which nurtures the plant or the tree, whichever it is, to return back around to not only feed itself, but other life forms as well to come back. So that's one of the things that God really likes to have is change. Here's another way of being able to manifest the same thing. You start out with the seeds of a coffee bean, all right, or a coffee plant. So it grows up, then you get the beans off of the coffee plant, and you can see as they get matured and then roasted and then ground up into coffee, and there you go. You have a cup of coffee there at the end. Now we kind of interfere with that cycle of life. Instead of the powder going back into the ground and starting the whole process again, we drink it and it makes us really happy. Me anyway, I'm a coffee drinker. Remember to drink it black, no cream or sugar, as Cayce said. All right, but this is another one of the cycles of life that shows you that not only does it have its own cycle, but it also helps us to be able to enjoy life that much better. This is kind of interesting to look at, and you're going, what exactly is that? Is that like a volcano? Or really, it's a beautiful thing in nature, and we tend to think very two-dimensionally here on the earth. The reason I say that is because we look up at a beautiful sunset and we see the clouds and it's just gorgeous, but that's the only angle that we typically get to see. What you're seeing here is a shot from an airplane above the clouds, and you're getting ready to see a sunset there. So you're able to, what you're seeing is the sunset and how it looks like when you're above the clouds. I guess we don't get to see these things as long as we're tied to the surface of the earth, so just look what lies ahead of us once we release our mortal bonds and no longer have to come back as humans. Now, This next one is that's all it's going to do. It's a GIF or a moving picture. But I think one thing that's fascinating about this is not only is it wonderful to be able to see the butterfly in flight, but it's somewhat enhanced to be able to see it. But it's showing that the powder that is actually coated onto the wings of the butterfly is constantly being released and actually acts as food, as it goes back and becomes nutrients into the ground for the very plants that it is going from flower to flower and keeping that whole ecosystem going just by being who it is. Now, another one that's kind of tough for us to, if we're thinking about this, remember that the statistic comes up that says that 80% of the dust inside of our homes is made up of dead skin cells or human skin cells that have just flaked off, and now they're back in ashes to ashes, dust to dust as well. So there's really a whole lot more going around us that we never see or imagine when we don't stop to think and analyze these things. Now, this is a graphic that it's pretty boring compared to the other ones because it doesn't move, it doesn't do anything but just sit there. And in fact, it's one that I used in part 1 of Manifestations of Spirit in 3 Dimensions. But I want to cover it briefly here because a video that I have coming up right after this slide does a great job of explaining it if you've had the fundamentals or background that I have here. For instance, if you have the 0 dimension, if you want to call it that, in which there's that singularity or that point, it's that 0 dimension. If you're a being in the 0 dimension, you don't recognize that anything else exists. All right, so there you don't see anything, you don't hear anything, you were just boom, you're right there all on your own. Now, if you're kind of in 1 dimension and what you just think of a line going in one direction, let's say that it's going from left to right. This means this is the head of the 3 different people that see right here, and unfortunately it's kind of like pack mules. This guy gets to see this guy's butt, this guy sees this guy's butt, and so on. So you only see a dot there in front of you as you're moving along, and let's assume that they have ears and can communicate, so this person can talk to this one and that one and vice versa. So they possibly are able to communicate with each other, but they don't see anything more than the dot in front of them and can't even imagine an existence where there's anything except what is that dot directly in front. Now, if you go to 2 dimensions in which you have length and width right there, but no depth to the whole thing, then you wind up just being like this shape here is a rectangle. It could be a pentangle, octagon or whatever, however many sides you would have in there. But what you would see has to do with whatever passes through the plane. For instance, if I were to say that this is the plane you're in, and I take my little remote and I start passing this through the plane, and all I can see is in this direction, what I'd see is a line that would go exactly as wide as this is, that would actually get thinner and then disappear altogether. And so you see a line in front of you of varying widths. Now, you would be able to know how much of an angle there is by rubbing up against it, and then all of a sudden you turn left and you say, well, that's a 90-degree angle because I was going along, and now all of a sudden I shoot to the left. If it was a steeper angle or more of a triangle, then it would go like that. And so a circle would have, it'd just be a continuous slide all the way around. And of course, 3 dimensions, I just have it up there to be able to put context to the other ones here. So the 3 dimensions now has the same length and width. Now it has the depth to go along with it. And here's the interesting part. It has to do with how to be able to communicate with the dimensions that are beneath us. For instance, a 2-dimensional being could come over here and surprise a 1-dimensional being by touching it right in its center. You could touch those people right in the center. It'd be like feeling somebody touching you right inside of your stomach, and you're going, how are you able to do that? Well, the 2-dimensional being right here understands that you can touch outside, but you as a 3-dimensional being, you could go in there and touch its center as well. So you start thinking about how does a 3-dimensional being center get touched, and we'll be able to get into that in a second. But now we're going to go ahead and take a look at not yet, but a video that is called Flatland, or actually it's a movie trailer for Flatland. Flatland was a movie that started about 100 years ago as a book from a mathematician who was trying to describe the very things that I have right here, and really made it a metaphysical kind of project as far as saying There are two-dimensional beings and one of them, the hero, if you will, gets approached by a three-dimensional being that is able to show them what the reality of his two dimensions are. And how did he do that? He literally pushed him out of his plane that he was in, put him up on his end, and suddenly he's able to see everything down below him. I know there's a lot of logic problems with that, but that's how the movie worked. So now he's able to be a three-dimensional being, if you will, looking down on his earth, and he wants to go back and tell them the truth of what their reality is like, and that there are more dimensions than what they understand. And of course, he's going to be called a heretic for that. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the video.
Imagine a vast plain, a world of only 2 dimensions, on which triangles, squares, pentagons, and other figures live and move freely about.
Configuration makes the man.
Calculate, calculate.
Get to your squaricle! Now!
You're only a square. Thanks, brother.
They know nothing of our 3-dimensional world.
Such a notion is, of course, absurd and furthermore, illegal.
But that's all about to change.
Where did you come from?
I come from space, the 3rd dimension.
No, you're not serious.
Based on the beloved novel by Edwin A. Abbott.
Tonight our world faces a grave threat.
I can prove there is another dimension to space that is upward.
That's so hard to imagine. But wouldn't that be amazing?
My own infinite universe of 0 dimensions!
Wonderful. We're going to be truncated. Oh, not that angle!
I came to reveal the truth of the 3rd dimension, no more.
Dude, you're freaking me out!
What exactly is a dimension?
Mathematics, reason, and imagination will help reveal the truth.
Flatland, the movie.
The 3rd dimension is real.
So what you have right there is a movie trailer. You could go online and find Flatland the movie and be able to watch it for yourself. It's not that long. I want to say it's half hour, 45 minutes to watch the thing. And it's obviously well produced, and you saw probably the names in the credits there of Martin Sheen and Kristen Bell as far as voicing the main 2 characters in the whole thing. So it really is a great depiction of what I'm trying to talk about. If you can imagine that 2 dimensions have enough trouble even thinking it's sacrilegious to think that 3 dimensions exist, that's what I can say about people who are giving grief about a presentation like this. It talks about a 4th dimension and more existing beyond ours. Now, what you're seeing here is my depiction of what the 4th dimension is somewhat like, and how it interrelates to us here in 3 dimensions. So if there is no time or space, just imagine for a moment if we see this block literally turning back on itself and slipping right back through itself again. If we talk about that one circle in which we live and move and have our very being within God, let's think of it as a box right now, and we literally think about one frame of film after another going through itself like that, and we see that as being motion. We see that as having dimensions, and in fact, we're still standing still. So you can think of all life as being an epic movie that's laid out before you with a 70mm film, like unraveled in a straight line in the floor. And all of the characters in the movie are limited to staying within those frames. And one goes to the next, goes to the next. You can't jump around in it. However, those of us that are outside of that movie are able to look at the frame that's in this part of it and that in the middle, and we can jump ahead and see to the end, back to the beginning, anywhere we want to move about. So a physical body only can jump one frame at a time in a forward direction, just like any movie plays, whereas people that are beyond that, say in the 4th dimension or higher, are not limited by a physical body to have to move in that way. So if you really want proof of the true nature that we are pure consciousness, I can invite you just for a moment to visualize in your mind the first place you can remember living. Now, with that image fixed in your mind, how long did it take for you to get there? I mean, Did it take any time at all? You just had a picture show up in your mind, and probably you had to travel quite a distance, probably a few years and along with that. So time and space didn't make any difference to be able to put your consciousness right back into a place that you couldn't possibly go in time and space with the physical body. So we can go anywhere in the universe and at any time we desire simply by thinking about it in our true nature. But I just wanted to give you an exercise that gives you an idea of how it works when you no longer are limited by a physical body. Now, this graphic I had used before, but it's a great way to talk about infinite time and space. I'll let it do its circle one time through, and then we'll go ahead and talk about what happens. Now, if you were to think of that I'm holding a piece of paper right here, just like this, and then it turns into a tube. If I were to just hold it up flat, you remember the little bouncing ball I had that went by? And it kept going and going and going, and it seemed like a second it exited this side of it, it re-entered back in here. So it kept doing the same thing over and over again. Well, that was a lapsed time as far as it moving around. If I take that paper and I fold it together into a circle or into a tube like that, you realize that it seems like it's got an infinite amount of time in order to elapses to be able to go around the tube like that. Now, an infinite amount of space is just like that. When you make a donut like that, it's also called a torus. And the idea is now you have an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of space as you tend to go this way to go around the tube. And then when it winds up making the torus, then you have an infinite amount to be able to go this way as well. So now you are able to envision, how do we have infinite time and space when it's still just that one circle that's sitting right there in the middle in which we live and move and have our very being. It's still that one point in consciousness that we call God. Now what you're looking at is we've jumped inside of the torus. So this is what it would look like if we're inside of that blue and white checkered torus that we were looking at before. Notice how consistent this pattern is here right now. And that's what I'm guessing the world would look like if there were no free-willed beings involved. In other words, if God just says, do it like this, and then there's nothing else to change anything, it just continues on and on and on like this in this perfectly laid out sequence that you see before you from the point of view of inside of the torus. Now, obviously you're talking about harmony and symmetry is going to remain constant throughout, but it's not all that exciting. I mean, how long can you look at this graphic right here and go, well, okay, that's nice, but I'm pretty much done with it. So you need it to get a little more exciting. So if we create souls that have free will and they can change things around as well as ourselves, it starts to look something like this. Now you're inside the torus, and the torus kind of has this corkscrew effect that's going in there, and you can see that it's a lot more interesting to try to keep up with it, but there's the horizon of the torus right there as it tends to go around and around in a pattern like that forever. Now we still have, you know, symmetry and harmony, and it doesn't look like the world's coming to an end like it tends to for humankind sometimes, but we're building up to that. So this is what it looks like when you start adding something other than, here it is, we're just going to go march forward in a straight line forever and ever, and you add some free will choices to it. This one gets a little more interesting as well. Now, imagine that this is a three-dimensional torus sitting inside the fourth-dimensional torus that is surrounding it. And notice that this thing is going in, if we look at it from the top down in the direction that we have here, it's going in a clockwise direction. And notice that the fourth dimension around it is going in a clockwise direction, but there's also other motion going out here on the side. All right, so in other words, we are not limited by staying in lockstep with the third dimension when you're in the fourth. You can go faster, you can go slower, you can stay right with it if that's what you want to do. And notice that we're on the outside able to look inside of the third dimension, but if you're inside the third dimension, it's like a one-way mirror. You're not able to see out in the other direction. So this is a great graphic depiction of what I think happens, that we are not limited by the time or space. We can pick up and drop ourselves in anywhere we want to within the three dimensions if we're not limited by a physical body and by the time and space limitations of the third dimension right there. Now, in talking about how do we reincarnate together as having, do we choose our parents? That's probably one of the more popular videos that we have out there as well, that explains what is the process we go through in order to be able to choose the parents, the family that we have, the life circumstances, what are my physical characteristics going to be, my talents, my intelligence, my opportunities in life. And I think this graphic is somewhat good. If you think about every time this thing moves, that it's talking about another incarnation. Now you can see that you have these colored dots that are right here, and they wind up being in different situations every time they move. So somebody could be in the same family one time, another time they could be business partners, another time they might share an interest in a hobby or a particular sport. They might even be part of the same spiritual family or organization, whether it be a church or something like the Edgar Cayce organization. And you can say every time there's a new incarnation, the dynamics of the relationships move. But you know what's interesting is that as you go from one incarnation to another, we do tend to congregate together. In fact, Cayce says if you have met someone, you've met someone. You've been with them in a past life. If you have an interest or go someplace, you probably have been there in a past life. And the reason for that is if we are developing karmic patterns with these particular individuals, that means that it makes sense for us to be in close proximity to the ones that we built the karmic relationships with in order to be able to work out the karma with them. Now, these colored dots make it easy to see those, but recognize that every single one of these white dots is doing the same thing with their own soul grouping right there, and that there is a larger, and we can just show it as a square here, say this is the United States, and this row right here has to do with one state, you know, Texas, California, New York, Arizona, all the states going down. And so you could look at it and say, these things change around a little bit, but you go from the individuals to the classes to the masses right there. Cayce said that in many, many relations. Now here's another way to be able to look at a similar concept in terms of moving together as soul groupings. And you'll definitely, it can be that these are family members that are all coming together into the next circle that's there as they move forward into their incarnations. It's maybe a little easier for you to understand, especially since the dots, if you will, tend to make the shapes a little more concentrically and be able to follow it like that. So a Cayce reading tells us when we're looking at this that yes, we do better when we congregate in families to be able to work on patience, work on faith, love, joy, happiness, and especially cooperation. But when you're looking at this, you're seeing a harmony in terms of the visual patterns. Another one that throws people for a loop is when Cayce said that if you learn music, you pretty much learned everything. That's an amazing statement that comes from him on that. And so I want to cover quickly what it is that music looks like to us and what it might look like in other dimensions as well. Now, if you understand that music is a sine wave, all sine waves are vibrations like that, and so let's think of this as being, instead of it being an S, you take the S and in the middle you put a hinge on it and bring it around. It's literally a circle. And now you're seeing kind of a round peg in a square hole moving around in here. But notice that this thing is going in a circle inside of a square, but notice that one red dot. Take a look at it and notice that all it's doing is moving from that side to this side. In other words, it's on its own path. It's not on the same path as any of these other dots that are sitting around here at all. So in its own path, through patience, through cooperation with others, we keep the wheels of life rolling around, as you're seeing right here, in such a way that it winds up working together beautifully. Now, if I were to follow this dot, and it goes up here, and then it comes right back down here again. So each one of these things is on its own path, its own direct line of saying, this is what I'm set to do this time, and yet it's working like a machine or gears or pulleys together. Now, this is a more complex way of being able to look at it, but I'm going to try to show you how different dimensions work together. Now, you just saw how you have this circle that goes around, and now I have a circle within a circle. So think of this big gray circle as being the three-dimensional Earth, and here we are in our human lives, and notice that this dot is going to go right down here, and then it's going to go right back up to where it came from again, and then it's going to go right back down. So it's the same essential graphic as we had before, but we're going to add to what's happening in our lifetimes on Earth is, let's say that these purple balls that are going through the holes are actually our souls that move in and out of the Earth plane. So if the big box is our solar system and the circle here is the third dimensional Earth, here's an interesting thing. If I were to follow this ball right here, it goes through that hole. Now watch that hole as it comes around, that same ball will go through the same hole. And the fascinating part about this is that I could add a different level for each one of the dimensions that are out there, and it would still work the same way, that the timing would work out so that the soul winds up landing in that particular body at that particular time in that place on Earth, and winds up being a perfect fit for what the karmic circumstances are that we have brought together for that particular life. I'm going to play a video here in just a moment. It's kind of a catchy tune from Mozart. Now, what you're seeing here are dots and dashes, kind of like Morse code. There's something else that it winds up being representative of, but if you see these dots, these are like shorter notes, and these are longer notes. But what you're literally seeing here is a visual representation of sheet music for a player piano. So if you will watch that this is all going to go down in the video, but as this comes down, it corresponds with when this guy's little finger is going to come over here and hit this key. So if you see this button right here, the green dot, and he's hitting that key on the piano, the C note right there, it's corresponding to that. The longer ones means he's going to hold on to it longer. So the short ones are little staccato notes, and these are the longer notes that are on there. Go ahead and hit the video. So you are seeing a couple of ways. One, it can look like black and white keys on a keyboard. It can look like dots and dashes like Morse code, or as a player piano reads it. And one thing that's kind of hard to see here is the guy probably had to read sheet music, which had little, circles, little dots, and the bars hanging off of it from the sheet music that he had to read to learn how to do that song to begin with. So there are some representations of what music can look like just to begin with. This is another one that's really kind of fascinating to me because, first of all, imagine that we have three levels of existence, which has to do with the blue line saying that that's our physical, and the red is the mental, and the green is the spiritual. All right, and notice that what the arrow, follow the green arrow for a second, and what the arrow is doing is having a line go off of it, and it's following the arrow as it goes up and down and creates the vibrations of the universe. And so as our spirit starts to move us, then all of a sudden, if we keep everything else in sync with it, you wind up having this beautiful pattern in which you have perfect harmony. Now, how do you know it's perfect harmony? When you wind up having these things cross the middle line together, that's what we hear as being harmonious notes. This is a physical representation of perfection. It's a physical representation of harmony, of cooperation, of patience in order to be able to make that happen. But every time these things cross over, you wind up having them hitting there at exactly the same spot in the middle line. So you have an excellent visual representation of the physical, mental, and spiritual working in harmony together, and how that actually translates into music that is pleasant to our ears. Our next one here is a video that I have shown in previous presentations, but it deals with the question of whether or not the universe rearranges itself according to our individual free will choices that we make. The reason that this is such a good visual depiction of how vibrations change everything is that we're going to show salt crystals here in a second that are representative of the tiniest, bits of matter, if you will, in this manifest universe. And we're going to watch how they wind up changing according to the vibrations that come up. So we wind up having an audio speaker right here. It has a metal black plate that's screwed into the top of it right here. So the speaker is able to come from an oscillator. In this case, it's doing 100 cycle tone. It'd be like boop, like that. Throw salt crystals down on that metal plate with the speaker under it, and then set the frequency to 345 hertz. This will happen every single time you set it to 345 hertz. They add a little more salt that keeps pushing over the edge, and they set it to 1033 hertz, and this pattern emerges every single time they do it. And so you keep upping the frequencies on it. Here's 1820, and you have an even more elaborate pattern that emerges every single time you hit that frequency. So you're going to see this keep repeating over and over again. If we think of that speaker as being the soul, the vibratory pattern of our thoughts, and it's manifesting through to the three-dimensional earth. The earth conforms itself to our mental thought patterns. In the same way that science is showing us that salt crystals will do this according to what frequency they're being maneuvered, the entire universe rearranges itself according to the thought patterns that each one of us emanate. It's just and by the way, as you heard me say, it does these exact same patterns at each one of those frequencies every time. So it's not just a random occurrence, it is something that is literally set in nature, that when you get into the right frequency, the right harmony, the right overtones, that you're going to wind up being able to create beautiful patterns with this entire thing. Now, we have one of my favoriteest videos ever, because it talks about, in very real terms, why I believe the millennium is already upon us. It seems like the world's falling apart out there. I remember reading something humorously that they had a translation from some old clay tablets that they had found, I think that was like 3,500 years ago. And when they translated it, it came out to say, the younger generation is so lost and so lackadaisical and so not with it, that I doubt that our human existence will last more than a few more generations. Now that was 3,500 years ago, and yet here we are. So I tend to think that we are already within the millennium itself. And I know that sounds a bit off, but hear me out on this, because from an earlier slide, I talked about what happens on the earth as a past condition of what's already been created in our minds in the mental or higher dimensions. So this video shows how all of the three-dimensional components for creating ice are met. Now, what are those components? You're supposed to have water, all right? And you have to get the temperature cooled down enough. And then there's something else that we're going to see that's an interesting ingredient that's called a catalyst, that's going to be the thing that is required to be able to go from, it looks like we should have ice, we don't have ice yet, and now we need to be able to create a catalyst or a thump. You're going to find out that we thump this thing, and the next thing you know, it turns directly into ice instantly, within seconds, as far as how that works. Go ahead and hit the button.
Bottles, and they've never been opened, so the water is extremely pure. Now the secret to instant ice is just about as simple as placing your bottles in the freezer. I let these ones sit for 2 hours and 45 minutes exactly. And here you can see the water is still liquid, but it's actually cooled down to a temperature well below freezing. All it takes from this point is a sharp jolt to the bottle, and you can see the water flash freezes to ice right in the palm of your hand. How cool is that? You can also start the reaction by using an ice crystal like one of these ice cubes. Just carefully remove the cap from the bottle and pour the water directly onto the ice. The water immediately begins to crystallize, giving you the power to create your own instant ice sculptures. The end result is a slush that has the consistency of a watery snowball, which of course is 100% edible and refreshingly delicious. Now try pouring your super cooled water into a clean glass and drop a bit of ice right in the center. You'll see the ice crystal begins to grow until it fills the glass completely. That's perfectly chilled for a hot summer's day. Alright, let's finish up by dipping just the tip of an ice cube in to see what happens. Within a couple of seconds, it's frozen in place and the entire cup is solid.
All right, so you're able to see what I was talking about there, in which I believe we already have the conditions in place for the Millennium to manifest on Earth. However, we haven't experienced enough of a thump in order to act as the catalyst that it takes to solidify such a spiritual ideal as 1,000 years of peace. So I would imagine that even as we're looking at these things, at the time of this video, we were right in the middle of the lockdown of the coronavirus, COVID-19. And so one reason why we don't have much of an audience out there is we're trying to keep in keeping with all of those rules and regulations. And so I wanted to point out that something that is just as traumatic as some of the events that go on in this day and age, when they come together, it can be that thump, that catalyst on the side, and it can be as gentle as pouring water over the ice. So how much of a thump or a catalyst we need in order to be able to manifest the millennium is up to us. It can be gentle or it can be a whack, and there we have it. Now, this is where I scientifically prove that God exists. And I'll tell you where this started was a number of years ago, about 100 years ago when I was in Physics 101. The professor in the class said, I want to be able to have each of you break into teams and prove the law of gravity. And what he gave us was a little, there were about 10 groups, and each of us had these little ski jumps, is what I'll call them. They weren't any bigger than about this, and it was just some angle iron that went in a J. And you put a little ball bearing here at the top, and you let it go, and the ball bearing would go off of the end of the J, and it would land, and he gave us some carbon paper and graph paper for where the ball was going to land, and so we'd let the ball go, it'd go up, and it'd land. Let the ball go, it'd go up, and it'd land, and see how consistently the ball would land at the other end. Now, with 10 groups, we went in there, and we went ahead and ran a 10-run experiment. So we did 10 different times we drew out the ball bearing. Do you know that not one person at any time proved the law of gravity? It did not go 32 feet per second per second. It didn't land in the same space, exactly at the same time. But what happened was the professor gathered all of the papers together and said, we actually have proven the law of gravity, just not with your experiments, because it's come within the accepted parameters of what the real scientific results would be if you did something like what we see in this video. So go ahead and hit the button and we'll see how they do this for real.
Galileo's experiment was simple. He took a heavy object and a light one and dropped them at the same time to see which fell fastest. Now in this case, the feathers fell to the ground at a slower rate than the bowling ball because of air resistance. So in order to see the true nature of gravity, we have to remove the air. It takes 3 hours to pump out the 800,000 cubic feet of air from the chamber.
We dropped 2 Militor in the last 30 minutes.
But once it's complete, there's a near perfect vacuum inside.
6104 manual, 10% open. Station 1, go for drop. PCV 30-1, pressure set point at 240 psi. We are go for drop.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Cameras on. 2, 1. Release. Exactly. They came down exactly the same. Wow.
Look.
Watch right there. Look at how they hit right there.
Exactly.
You're back on the side.
Exactly the same.
Feathers don't move, nothing.
Look at that.
And so how does this wind up being able to scientifically prove that God exists? Well, the experiment that I like to use in being able to make such a claim is meditation. If you go into a meditative state and you do it correctly, you wind up making a connection with the divine within. For me, it took a long time, but once I was able to make that connection, in the time I was able to start meditating correctly, I don't fail to make that connection with God inside. The kingdom of heaven is within, as Jesus said. And so I remember speaking with an atheist one time who I told him, my proof is meditation. I connect with God every time I try it. And the atheist says, I've meditated before, and I've never made a connection with God. And I said, okay, now if we go to the gravitational experiment here, and you realize that you don't have the right equipment or the right process or even the right competency in order to be able to make the experiment happen, as you just saw right here, they were able to prove that gravity did in fact exist and perform consistently according to the laws as science has it right now. But why would you say that it's any different for meditation? I would say that you're not doing it correctly, and that if you do it correctly, then you make a connection with the divine within each and every time you do it. It didn't go over too well with him, I can tell you that. So proof like what I'm representing right here does little to convince a non-believer of all the things I just described here tonight. But it is very compelling for those of us who have ears to hear and eyes to see. And I thank you for being here.